director at Hancher, who has been the guiding light for all of us through the events for this week. I'm delighted to have you all here for this panel, in which we thought what we would try to do is provide a kind of biographical, cultural, literary context for the play that I hope, the reading that I hope many of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, that I hope many of you will be able to attend on Saturday night. It's just an historic event, very exciting for us. I see in the audience some of the folks who were on the panel last night. That was just a wonderful opening of the week. I learned so much about the history of the Black experience here in Iowa City and at the University of Iowa. And we have a whole week of events before us. I hope that most of you got, or all of you got, a copy of the program of the week-long schedule, and there are plenty of extra copies that we can get to you if you don't have a copy. And if you notice, I just want to point out the upcoming events so you'll be aware of all your opportunities. If you want to jump in the car, as several of our panelists are, you can head on over to Cedar Rapids to the African American Museum for another panel discussion. Tomorrow afternoon, Kathleen Edwards, a curator at the University of Iowa Museum of Art, is going to give a talk about another African American alum, Elizabeth Catlett, who is a sculptor, a living sculptor, who was, among her many talent credits, created a statue of Ralph Ellison. And so she'll be talking about Elizabeth Catlett's work. And then on Thursday at 7 p.m. in Shambaugh, there will be, I don't know if any of you have participated before in one of these civic reflection conversations, but this is a really wonderful opportunity in which a discussion leader will use a short poem that everybody will read together right there on the spot to launch a discussion about issues around diversity in our community. And she had Georgina Dodge, who's a vice president of the university, is the discussion leader. She's done this many times before, and it's a really wonderful, surprisingly collaborative event, these discussions. So I encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. Friday afternoon from 5 to 7 in the Old Capitol Mall, you too can be on a radio show, the World Canvas radio show that will feature a panel discussing the Ellison's novel and the staged version of it. And then finally, the culmination, the exciting event on Saturday night at Shambaugh again at 7 o'clock. Well, there will be a staged reading involving local actors, students from our community, from the university, and it promises to be just really exciting. So I hope you can be there. I'm going to quickly introduce all four of our panelists today, and then what we've agreed is that each of the panelists will speak for 10, 15 minutes or so about his or her topic about the Invisible Man, and then we hope we'll have time at the end to open up for questions, conversation across the panel and with you all. I want to warn you too that we are all on radio. We're television, actually. We're on the library channel. We're on the big time. And so we'll work out how to use the microphones when you ask, if you want to ask questions. Or else we'll repeat them for you to make sure it gets communicated to others who will watch today and watch the program later. So our first panelist will be my colleague, Horace Porter. And Professor Porter is the F. Wendell Professor of English and American Studies and a Professor of African American Studies. He joined Iowa's faculty in 1999, and he is the author of Jazz Country, Ralph Ellison in America. In January, he will very bravely become the Chair of American Studies and African American Studies. It's a big job. Michael Hill, next to him, is also in the Department of English and the Department of African American Studies. And Michael has recently finished a monograph with a fantastic title, The Ethics of Swagger, Prize-winning African American Novels, 1977 to 1993. It's forthcoming shortly from the Ohio University Press. Michael and Lena Hill have also written a book together, which is a book specifically on Invisible Man, a reference guide, and I hope I'm getting that title right, Invisible Man, on the Invisible Man in the 21st Century, and that book is out and available. And Lena Hill is also a professor in English and African American Studies, and her article titled "The Visual Art of Invisible Man, Ellison's Portrait of Blackness" is part of what brought our director and our writer to town for this week-long residency. It was published in a very prestigious journal in literary studies called American Literature. And Lena is also has finished a book that is titled "Visualizing Blackness and the Creation of the African American Literary Tradition," which looks at almost 200 years of African American literature in light of visual culture. Really exciting. And then our last panelist and our special guest for the week is Christopher McElron. Yep. Is that right? Thank you. Who is the producer and director, and his credits are a long, long list. Very impressive. He is a New York-based producer and director. He co-founded the Classical Theater of Harlem and has been its executive director was the director from 1999 to 2009. He has produced over 41 productions. He is a busy and successful artist. And he has come to us, and also 30 professional productions and four world premieres. And his work has been recognized with the American Theater Wing Award, or the Outstanding Artistic Achievement Award, Drama Desk Award, Edwin Booth Award. The list goes on and on and on. And he found Lena through her scholarship. Thank the heavens for Google and Google Scholar. And we are thrilled that thanks to the work of Hancher and a number of other collaborators, including, I'm proud to say, the Obermann Center, we now have the opportunity to share in the building production of Ellison Man on Stage, which will premiere in Chicago in February. So welcome to our guests, and off we'll go.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today to speak about this wonderful novel. And I think I should start by saying I think the public library is an appropriate space to have a gathering like this because, as some of you may know, others may not know, that Ralph Ellison was very much concerned about the public dissemination of knowledge in the United States and in democracy. And he was one of the principal founders, original board members of public television. So it's conceivable that without him, public television as we know it today may not indeed exist. So I thought I would just throw that out. So it's a wonderful thing. I also want to thank the organizers of this event, Chuck Swanson, who I've had the pleasure of meeting, Lena Hill, my colleague, who has been working very, very hard on this, Teresa, and others to make this series of events possible. I have about 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to leave 2 or 3 for my colleague here, Michael Hill. But I wanted to start by saying this is a wonderful novel. It's challenging. Many of you have read it. Some of you are students I see out there. Some of you are my students know that you might want to sometimes reread it again, given its complexity. But in so many ways, it's very, very straightforward. It's very much a deeply straightforward American novel about a young man who goes to college in the South, yet expelled, goes to New York City, that wonderful place, and experiences all kinds of challenging tests of what he is to become, who he is, and things of that sort. So what I'd like to do briefly by way of introduction to the book is just talk about some general Ellisonian themes that appear in this novel and in works in general. So first of all, to give you a little bit of context about the novel, it was published in 1952. Some of you may be aware that it's won the National Book Award. So think about it this way. It comes just before the very beginning of the height of the civil rights movement. It comes 3 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. It's 2 years before the Brown decision. And so it comes at a moment in which all of these issues about inclusion of the Negro, inclusion of people in American life who have been excluded, it hits right at the heart of that. It's a few years before the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So all of this is on Ellison's mind, and he dramatizes this to great effect in the book itself. I just want to talk about a few of the themes that I think are there that are Ellisonian in nature, that for me have always been a part of the way that I have viewed American life culturally since that moment of reading it so many years ago when I was a freshman. First of all, the idea he has an essay called What America Would Be Like Without Blacks. The idea of imagining American culture without the Negro as the African Americans were called at that particular time. And Ellison essentially says that it is impossible to imagine American culture without the Negro, that the cultural DNA of this country is part and parcel of blackness as we know it, that there is an intermixture, it has always been from day one, and to imagine American culture that is white on the one side and black on the other is a false and foolish way of thinking about culture as we know it. That's a fundamental Ellison assumption of thinking about things. Two, that he talks about what he uses the phrase, the marvelous and the terrible. What does he mean by the marvelous and terrible? He means that terrible, yes, that you can think of all the things that have happened to the Negro African Americans from slavery forward, of victimization, of discrimination, of brutalities, of this and that, of welfare and imprisonment. He says that's one way of thinking about it, and one would be justified in thinking in that way. But there's also the marvelous, and you would be remiss to miss that element and that component of American life, Negro, African American culture and life, that's been there once again from the very beginning. A sense of cultural style and a sense of elegance, a sense of something so simple as a preference during the 50s of driving a Cadillac and driving it well, things of that sort. And then there's the idea of transcendence, that despite all the things that have happened that are negative, that there's a tradition in black life, in Negro life, that teaches one to be stronger at the broken places. That transcendence means that you are not just some victim down there that nobody can see, but that you are, though perhaps excluded from the apparent fabric of American life, discriminated against, you're right there existentially in the middle of the social drama. And laws have been made and that affects everyone based on the existence of the Negro, and so forth and so on. That you have been there to observe American life, and you can make judgments despite your position as a janitor, as a cook, as a maid. You're apparently invisible, but you're having a profound impact on that household, whether it's the White House or wherever you are in some ways, and you're not really invisible. So that brings me quickly, I'm going very fast because I have to. I want to save 3 of my minutes for Professor Hill here. To chapter 10 in Invisible Man. Chapter 10 is a chapter in which our young protagonist goes to this paint factory and he meets this old man who's sort of ornery, and he works down in the basement of this paint factory, and he doesn't want to deal with anybody. He has an attitude. And so there's one point where he goes down there and there's an explosion, and the man gives, the old janitor or whatever you want to call him, gives this young man a lecture. And he says something to this effect. He said,
I'm the only one here at the company. I was here when the founder started this company, and I am the one who came up with the slogan, Keep America Pure with Liberty Paints. It's called the Liberty Paint Company. And I am the one who came up with the formula for this paint. And I am the one who knows if anything goes wrong, where all the nuts and bolts down here in the basement. There are no engineers down here. I'm the man. I'm the one who knows how to keep it all running and going. And so that's an Ellisonian sort of symbol of this apparently invisible entity, this person down there who's nobody, but who is everybody. And so that's how he positions the Negro. And this character says, you know, I've been here ever since there was a here. All right? I've been here ever since I was here. We're the machines within the machines. That's all Ellisonian rhetoric that comes through within the novel. So that's what I have to say, except for one other thing, which I'd like to move forward and hand out. Jason, I saw you in the audience. Where are you? My student. Can you hand this out here? You put him to work. There are about 25 of these copies. I want to project quickly thanks to Professor Lena Hill, who has taught me that I have to view the visual. Pass it down. I have to look closely at the visual in Ralph Ellison's work. And somebody's going to ask a question a little bit later about the second novel and so forth. This is a little segment that was not published in the two versions of the second novel, in the second version that came out. And this is from published in 1973. This is the original, from the original, called Cadillac Flambe. And I get out another Ellisonian theme about the absurdity of American life, particularly when it pertains to blacks. Briefly, this is the story of a black man who hears a Senator Sunrader, on the radio, trashing the Cadillac. Why? Because too many black people are driving them. And they're crowded together. And he says, on the radio, I think we should change the name of the Cadillac to the Coon Cage 8. Because they're crowded together, you know, weaving recklessly through our nation's highways and carrying on, etc. And this guy who's a jazz musician, who's sort of driving his Cadillac, hears this and decides, okay, I'll teach this guy a lesson. He takes his gleaming white Cadillac, goes to the senator's estate, and sets it afire. And as the police are coming, he hears the sirens, he makes a speech. Take this Cadillac and my wonderful dreamboat, etc. And then they arrest him. But I wanted to read this passage because of the drama of it and because Professor Lena Hill taught me to look at this. So let's just look at this quickly and then I'll shut up. This guy's burning his Cadillac and the narrator says, a white reporter, "Why, that black son of the devil," someone shouted, and I had the impression of a wall of heat springing up from the grass before me. Then the flames erupted with a stunning blue roar that sent the spectators scattering. People were shouting now, and through the blue flames before me, I could see the senator and his guests running from the terrace to halt at the top of the lawn, looking down. The senator's having a barbecue. While behind me, there were screams, the grinding of brakes, the thunder footfalls as the promenaders broke and a great spontaneous wave up the grassy slope. Then, sensing the danger of exploding gasoline, receded hurriedly to a safer distance. Below, their screams and curses ringing above the roar of flames. So here comes the picture. How I wish for a cinema camera to synchronize with my tape recorder, which automatically I now brought into play as heavy fumes of alcohol and gasoline, those defining spirits of our age, filled the air. There before me, unfolding in tableau vivant, was surely the most unexpected picture in the year. In the foreground, at the bottom of the slope, a rough semicircle of outraged faces. In the mid-foreground of the gentle rise of the lawn, the white convertible shooting into the springtime air, a radiance of intense blue flame, a flame like that of a welder's torch, perhaps of a huge fowl being flambéed in Schwartz cognac. Then on the rise above, distorted by heat and flame, the dark-skinned, white-suited driver standing with his gleaming face, expressive of high excitement as he watched the effect of his deed. Then rising in the background, atop the grassy hill, the white-capped senator surrounded by his notable guests, all caught in postures eloquent of surprise, shock, and indignation. That's the picture for you. It's cinematic, and yet it's a still, really. You know, you see the foreground and all that. That is the last element of the Ellisonian imagination that I would like to leave with you. Much of it comes out in Invisible Man, but I wanted to use this example because it gets at the absurdity of American life and American culture, particularly when the Negro asserts his or her presence. Thank you very much.
With the 2 minutes that I have left. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate everyone's participation in all of the events, and we encourage, as Teresa has suggested earlier, that you would avail yourselves of all the opportunities this week. It's a fabulous event, and it's fabulous today to be able to interact with both the people on the panel, but also with you all later on. My section with regard to this panel is entitled Invisible Man in the Political and Literary Context of the Mid-20th Century. So it's my job in some ways to place the novel more thickly within the realm of black literary production in the 1950s, the 1940s and the 1950s, but also to place it more aggressively within a particular historical context. As I've suggested in the Invisible Man study guide or reference guide that Lena and I completed, the task of seeking to put Invisible Man in a historical context is something that gives you an appreciation for Sisyphus. Because at every moment that you feel you have the book fixed or placed comfortably, neatly in a category, or that you've given the detail that could illuminate exactly what it is that Ellison was up to, you've found the appropriate and the proper references, then you come to discover that actually what you needed was the name of a short line cook at Small's Paradise in 1936, not the President of the United States. So the difficulty in seeking to produce some sort of a comfortable context is something that arises once again at this moment. So that being said, I will forego any claim on exhaustion and choose instead to be particular. Thus leave out everything and focus only on what it is that I would like to talk about. So the two things that I'll deal with today is how Ralph Ellison sees himself as far as the burgeoning civil rights movement. Horace talked a little bit about Ralph Ellison in the context of the civil rights movement, coming certainly before the landmark decision of Brown v. Board in 1954, but nonetheless operating within a space, especially where African-American communities were highly sensitive to some profound efforts that were being undertaken on the part of agencies like the NAACP and also on the part of local agencies in an attempt to achieve racial equality. So really what I want to talk about today is what does the political landscape look like for an African-American at the moment that Ralph Ellison is writing Invisible Man? In the 1940s and 1950s, what does the landscape look like to you? In the mid-1950s, the New York Times decides that it is in their best interest to deploy a reporter whose sole job is to cover Supreme Court decisions. They send someone down to D.C. and they say, we need to have a reporter whose job it is to cover the Supreme Court. At the moment, this looks like a landmark decision on the part of a major paper. It looks like something that's very progressive and forward-looking for judicial scholars. For those who are interested in legal history, they say, wow, this is great. We should have thought of this earlier. African-American newspapers have been covering the decisions of the Supreme Court since the 1920s because they understood earlier that what was happening as far as judicial decisions in Washington had a life and death impact on their daily life. You can find exhaustive commentary on court decisions in the Pittsburgh Courier, in the Baltimore newspapers as early as the 1920s, because African Americans understood that legal decisions formed a crucial part of the way that they would identify and define themselves in this nation. Ellison begins Invisible Man at a moment where the judicial sphere was being transformed. Initially, judicial spaces were perceived strictly as punitive in their quality. You became a victim of a court as opposed to appealing to a court for justice. In the African American literary imagination, over and over again, we see instances where African American protagonists, African American defendants are looked upon as guilty and are waiting either to be sentenced or more usually to die. Before they could ever make it to the courtroom, before they could ever make it to some sort of a legal decision, quite often their plight was to die. They were taken from courts, they were taken from jails, they were taken from holding spaces, and they were lynched. That was justice. So the notion of the legal space as a remedial sphere, a sphere that you would go to appeal to for some sort of a justice, it was a very difficult idea for early 20th century African Americans to get their heads around. Ellison, coming along in the 1930s and the 1940s, actually arrived at the moment where the earliest inklings of the judicial space as a sphere of remediation, the earliest inklings were beginning to take shape in people's minds. And largely, that was because of the work of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund under the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton Houston is a lawyer who's educated at Harvard and goes on to become the dean of the Howard Law School. And he also heads up the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. When he gets down to the Legal Defense Fund, there are high-profile narratives of legal victory for black lawyers. So black people who are reading these newspapers begin to see instances where black lawyers are arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court and winning. They're actually able to receive a judicial remedy that provides for them some sense of optimism. So the first thing to understand about the hybrid dynamic that you see within the world of Ellison's Invisible Man, the sense of tremendous pathos, right? The sense of tremendous injury and pain, yet the moment of optimism or undertones of optimism is the nation itself is manifesting in its political, especially through this judicial lens, is manifesting that quality of the bittersweet. There's still enduring moments where the achievement of justice is difficult, but there are also signs that skill, moments and instances of African American skill are beginning to be appreciated, not just symbolically, but also practically. If you were a skilled attorney who could walk before the court and argue your case effectively, you're no longer living in a moment where that is a symbolic gesture. You're living in a moment where those gestures can have fruitful ends. So Ellison is operating in a space where those kind of realities are percolating from a judicial standpoint. From a legislative standpoint, he lives in a world where segregation is still the law of the land, but in 1943, William Levi Dawson, a black man, is elected to the Congress of the United States of America. First black man since Reconstruction. Just let that sink in. Right? Since Reconstruction. That's 1877. So first black man since Reconstruction to be elected to the Congress in 1943. 1944, Adam Clayton Powell joins Dawson in the Congress. The optimism of those visible markers of African American leadership in a legislative body that's connected to our national direction. Optimism. What's bittersweet? From 1943 and 1944, Dawson and Powell are the only African Americans in the Congress through 1955. So from the moment that Ellison is beginning to work on Invisible Man as a novel through to the moment of its publication, these are instances of the texture of the bittersweet that he deals with as far as the political landscape that he looks across. So in addition to seeing a political landscape that's dotted with these realities as far as the legislative dynamic is concerned, as far as the judicial dynamic is concerned, he also has to deal with the more personal reality of what does it mean in the 1940s and the 1950s to be a black author. More specifically, what does it mean to be a black novelist? And I want to draw some attention to that genre distinction because being a novelist in the 1950s was a little different from being a poet or from being a dramatist or from operating in other genres. To be a black fiction writer and to write extended fiction in the 1950s placed you in a vanguard. From the moment that the first African-American novel was published near the middle of the 19th century up until 1949, there were roughly 180 African-American novels published. So in a 100-year period, like from 1850-ish up to 1949, there were 180 novels published. From 1950 to 1959, there were 125 novels published. So in 100 years, 180 novels. In 10 years, in the decade in which Invisible Man appeared, in that 10-year period, 125 novels. A windfall with regard to novel production. Ellison operates within that space. He's a part of a group of folks who, to paraphrase James Baldwin, struggle to make a name for themselves. Baldwin has an essay collection, Nobody Knows My Name. And for all of the post-National Book Award celebrity that Ralph Ellison enjoys, for all of the prominence and conspicuous display of Ellison's achievements that we see within the 21st century, I'm always reminded, in part because of the instruction of senior colleagues like Horace, that Ellison was a part of an anonymous toiling throng in the 1930s. Nobody knew his name. He hadn't finished college. What does it feel like in the 1930s to be a college dropout and to want to write a novel? What does it feel like in the 1930s to jump on a train to get to college, to get beat up, to arrive so bruised that it's visible in your college admissions photos? What does it feel like to lose your mother as you're struggling in New York City to make a throw, to figure out who you are? Am I a sculptor? Am I a trumpet player? Do I write books? What do I do? So Ellison emblematizes the dance between the movement from 1950 to 1959, which saw African Americans publish 125 novels. Folks like Nathaniel Hooks, who was a welder at an industrial plant, publishing novels because, as his daughter says, that's what he wanted to do. He would pull a double and come home at 2 o'clock in the morning and sit down at his typewriter because it was important to him to be a published author. And Ellison was a part of that vanguard. He was a part of the group of folks who was striving on some level to write themselves into history. And the final thing that I want to say is that Ellison was a part of a group of individuals who felt that the novel was uniquely suited to transform the way that African Americans were viewed in this country. At the moment that Ellison and many of these writers in the 40s and 50s are emerging, sociology discourses dominate the public presentation of the African American identity. And those discourses invariably suggested that victimization had a determinative effect upon the black personality. If you were oppressed, you had no choice but to be defeated. If you were oppressed, your spirit had no choice but to be completely and utterly rendered prostrate. You had no choice but to be abject and to be pressed down into the ground. But as Horace has suggested earlier, everyday black folks recognize a resilience within their spirit that wasn't being registered in these sociological constructions of their lives. So when Gunnar Myrdal comes out with an American Dilemma and says, you're broken. You're a broken people. You're problem people. You're folks who somehow need to be sanitized. You need to be taken care of. We need to put you in a protectorship state. Ellison said, no. And his attempt with Invisible Man was to capture the durability of that spirit, was to capture and ultimately to epitomize the insistence of African-American authors that those portraits of defeat did not constitute the complete story. So I'll just leave it there.
Amen.
Good afternoon. I can't tell you how much it means to see such a good turnout. We so appreciate you being here. I want to thank Teresa for moderating the panel. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Chuck and I have just been having such a great time planning this. To see it come to fruition is wonderful. And to sit here with Chris, who we've had a great time with this week, and you are in for a treat on Saturday night, that I can promise you. I'm going to talk a bit about Invisible Man in the 21st century. And as I was thinking about how to approach this, I thought I'd turn to Ellison, because he thought about how we would engage his novel years after its publication. In fact, in a 1955 interview that he titled The Art of Fiction, and if anyone knows Henry James, he took that title from Henry James, so he clearly already had certain ideas of where he saw his literary legacy heading. But in this interview, he actually said that he didn't think the novel would be considered important 20 years after its publication in 1952. And I want to read the quote that Ellison, his words in this interview. He says, "It's not an important novel. I failed of eloquence, and many of the immediate issues are rapidly fading away. If it does last, it will be simply because there are things going on in its depth that are of more permanent interest than on its surface." Now, at first glance, it seems like he is being self-effacing to a fault. Here we are approaching the 60th anniversary of this novel. We have a whole week of activities formed around it. Clearly, from what my colleagues have said to begin with, it was important when it first hit the scene. It continued to be important in the 1950s. Professor Porter, reading these words, suggests that he knew he had a certain amount of eloquence in his writing. So what's he getting at? I think there's some truth in this quote. The truth is that the importance of it, its staying power, is not on the surface, but deeper. Ellison understood that. And those closing words have stayed with me as I've worked on Ellison over the years. I've been poring over the drafts of Invisible Man at the Library of Congress for about a decade. When I was there this summer, one of the librarians looked at me in the manuscript room and he said, "Are you a full professor yet?" And I said, "Actually, I'm not tenured, but I started as a very young graduate student coming here." But the collection of Ellison papers at the Library of Congress has over 46,000 items. There are 11 folders committed strictly to Invisible Man, the typescripts and the manuscript drafts. And as you pore over these, what you see is that Ellison madly revised this novel for years and years and years. He was not satisfied with a sentence or with a scene as he wrote it the first time. The actual archive is organized by episode. Some of these episodes, for those of you who are familiar with the novel, it might be The Brotherhood is the title of an episode. He might have 12, The Brotherhood has 12 folders committed to it within these boxes. So there are 12 boxes that make up the Invisible Man file, but there may be 12 folders. One folder might have 200 pages of handwritten script, of typed pages with sentences changed. Now, it's a bear to go through for a researcher, but you have to respect the process, and you have to acknowledge that Ellison was up to something pretty special, and he knew it. He was as concerned with the form and the content as he is with its impact. In fact, when he wrote a letter to Richard Wright in 1940, as he was beginning to wonder if he wanted to be a writer, he began to think in clear terms about the impact of great literature. And I love reading the letters between Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. Most of them come from the 1940s. Richard Wright published Native Son, his big text in 1940, and it became a kind of superstar. But at this time, they were both still young. I mean, they talk about, going out and seeing a waitress who they knew just wanted both of them. I mean, so there's funniness interwoven, but they're really serious about the craft of writing. So as we reflect back on Invisible Man from our vantage of 2011, I want to first think about what Ellison wrote to Richard Wright in 1940. And I want to read this quote, and it makes you wish that we still wrote letters today. But this is what Ellison wrote to Richard Wright. Part of my life, Dick, has been a lacerating experience, and I have my share of bitterness, but I have learned to keep the bitterness submerged so that my vision might be kept clear, so that those passions which could so easily be criminal might be socially useful. I know those emotions which tear the insides to be free, and memories which must be kept underground, caged by rigid discipline, lest they destroy, but which are precious to me because they are mine, and I am proud of that which is myself. Usually we Negroes refuse to talk of these things. The fact that I mention them now is an indication of the effect which your book has had upon me. And actually, he's referring to 12 Million Black Voices, which is a photo documentary that Richard Wright published. That's what he's referring to. He just read it, and he's telling him these are his responses. You write of the numbness which our experience has produced in most of us, and I must say that while I was never completely numbed myself, I've had to rigidly control my thawing, allowing the liquid emotion to escape, drop by drop, through the trap doors of the things I write. Lest I lose control, lest I be rendered incapable of warming our frozen brothers, which all good writing must do. Writing is an act of salvation. If you've read Invisible Man, these words feel like they could have been lifted from the opening pages of the text. And this is 5 years before Ellison even began to write the novel. But what it suggests to us is that why the novel remains so powerful in its exploration of race and identity and understanding of where one finds oneself in U.S. society is because Ellison was struggling with those issues for real. These were things that he was thinking of long before he decided to commit to the art of writing, to the craft of being a creative writer. These words return to that 1955 interview and remind us that this is the depth in the novel that he pushes us to look for underneath the surface. The other thing about these words, if you were at the panel last night listening to the Black Hawkeyes talk about their experiences here at the University of Iowa, you hear a strange echo that many African Americans were dealing with these issues at mid-century, that Ellison captured them. There's a kind of tension in the bittersweet accomplishment that derives from struggle, that brings people closer together, that creates something special, even in a situation that is, for the most part, negative. That's why this novel remains powerful enough, contains the strength to actually be the engine for this residency this week, because it continues to deal with issues that are relevant today. And yet, when I teach this novel to my classes that are often 99% white, what I realize is it doesn't just speak to the African American experience. It's universal. I don't have to tell my students that when the protagonist embraces invisibility, it's an invisibility, it's a claim to identity that supersedes race. That what he's bemoaning is that people don't see him for who he is. For his case, it is a racial response, but for others, right, people don't see you for any number of reasons, and my students get this. We had a fabulous class meeting yesterday with Chris directing students with a part of this script. And when Chris cast a white male student as Invisible Man, it was fine. Nobody thought that it compromised the role. The student rose to the task. It was fabulous. And again, it was a testament, I think, to the strength of the words that Ellison crafted in 1952 and that Chris has continued to be so devoted to in his script of this great play. Scholars get it too. as far as the power of this text. My own research has led me to think about the novel in some special to me, I should say, ways. One of the things when I was in that same interview that I began with, The Art of Fiction, Ellison talks a lot about Picasso. And when I first read this, I was early in graduate school. I thought it was important. I want to share some of these quotes with you to put my own research in context. Ellison said that Picasso inspired him. And he said it was because, quote, Picasso is the greatest wrestler with forms and techniques of them all. Picasso's art allows the viewer an orientation, both emotional and associative, which goes so deep that a total culture may resound in a simple rhythm, an image. Now, I was fascinated by this when I was first reading Invisible Man and thinking about its visual implications. And when I began doing my research at the Library of Congress, I discovered in the expurgated drafts all these moments where a character that never appeared in the published text, and never appeared even in those in the story itself, he only appeared as a Cubist portrait. Someone brought a Cubist portrait and talked about this character, and then another character in the text gives a mini dissertation on Cubism. It was not a good piece of writing. It was good that it was not included in the published text. But what it told me was that there was something to Ellison's interest in the visual. And now, after working on it for years, I argue that Ellison actually recreates museum experience in his novel. That as Andre Malraux, a theorist and writer that Ellison really admires, suggests, that the museum of modern times has burst beyond the traditional walls. That we have now a museum without walls, because reproductions are so numerous that we don't have to go to a museum to see the greatest pieces of art. Now, Ellison's interested in that for a different reason. He's interested in that because he suggests that the rigor with which we look at visual items in a museum, we should also use that rigor when we're looking at each other. That we shouldn't fall back on stereotypes and stale ideas that we associate with different races, ethnicities, genders, right? That when we see people, we should read them with intent, with intentionality, with passion, and that's how we're going to really get to know one another. That's how we'll overcome the idea that people are invisible. Now, why do I bring this up? Not to pub my book that I have both fingers and toes crossed that a publisher is going to take, and I'll get to stay here with you at the University of Iowa. No, but to suggest that the novel continues to encourage critics to deal with it in any number of ways. Just as I approach it with an interest in visuality and visual culture, critics approach it with an interest in Marxism and psychology and postmodernism and modernist work. From any number of angles, critics continue to find something very real and deep to deal with in this text. During his lifetime, Ellison didn't want to see this novel transposed to a different form other than literary. In 1952, he worked on a photo essay with Gordon Parks that was published in Life magazine. And that was the first time that sort of images were directly associated with the text. In 1980, Franklin Edition published Franklin Library published 2 illustrated editions of the novel, and Ellison didn't like either of them. He wrote that he was very disappointed with these publications. When Sidney Lumet approached him about making the novel into a movie, Ellison said no, and I want to read you what he says. He responded, "I deeply regret to inform you that my novel Invisible Man is not available for adaptation and never has been. I have been consistent in my refusal because I prefer that the book rest on its merits as a novel, to be read rather than transposed into a form for which it was not written. When someone from Marvel Comics approached him, he also said no." I guess he didn't want to see Invisible Man as a superhero. Now, I'm not setting Chris up here as someone who's going against what Ellison wanted. He's going to share with you a more complicated story. But what I do want to suggest is that Ellison wanted the novel to stand on its own merits for some time, that he wanted us to deal with it as a text before we had the opportunity to enjoy it on the stage. And from what I've seen through the rehearsals and what Chris has done with the classes, it's going to be good. But Ellison first wanted the novel to appeal to us in words, that we would have to deal with it in language. He never published a second novel. Horace read portions from the novel that he worked on for 40 years. But Ellison never published it, but he continued to work. He worked under the weight of the success of Invisible Man. And as he worked on this text, he continued to deal with many of the issues that made Invisible Man such a rich text. And this commitment, this steadfastness, this feeling of responsibility to continuing to deal with issues of race and identity, in my mind, that's what makes the craft that we see in Invisible Man have such staying power now in the 21st century.
Thank you all for coming. I am genuinely excited to be here this week. Thank you so much to Lena and to Chuck from Hampshire for making this possible. I'll talk a little bit about the process that we've been engaged in. I'm not a scholar, I'm a theater practitioner. So I'm most comfortable in a rehearsal room getting my hands dirty with actors. So I'll talk a little bit about how I came to be involved with this and what our artistic process has been over the past year, and where we hope the stage adaptation and full production will lead. So I was first introduced to Invisible Man when I was in college. I was actually in school for business and was struggling mightily with identity and how I fit into the world. And the reading the novel, it spoke to me on a very personal level about the issues of identity. And through the years, it kind of became a touchstone for me. Whenever I kind of felt lost in the world, I could pick up the novel, and somehow it would place me in a different context in my mind. And for 12 years, I ran an organization called the Classical Theater of Harlem. We were based up at the Harlem School of the Arts, and we produced classical theater that was deeply rooted within the community of the Harlem School of the Arts. And we had always toyed with the idea of doing an adaptation of Invisible Man. And we had reached out to the estate on, I guess, 2 occasions, and they told us no. And I didn't know about Sidney Lumet, so I don't feel bad about the no's back then, but now I feel tremendous pressure, even more so than I felt 2 minutes ago, to execute this enormous task that we've undertaken. But back in 2005, a filmmaker named Oren Jacoby approached me. Oren is a documentary filmmaker, Academy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker, brilliant guy. He came to me with an adaptation of Invisible Man and asked me if I was interested in helping him do a reading of it at the Tribeca Film Festival. At first, I was thoroughly intrigued by the idea, obviously, but I was also wondering, man, how the hell did he get them to say yes to allow this to happen? So we did a reading of his first adaptation, and it was strong, and it was in a really good place. He had spent a lot of time with it. He kind of came to the novel through a documentary he made about Susan Laurie Parks and her production Top Dog Underdog. And Oren had a previous relationship with John Callahan. They worked on a project together. John Callahan is the literary executor of the Ellison estate. And they had worked on a project, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years prior to Oren picking up picking up the novel to adapt it. And as Oren tells it, he was working with Susan Laurie Parks, and they started talking about the novel. And Susan Laurie said, Oren said to Susan Laurie, "You should adapt that novel. It would be brilliant, kind of examined through your voice." And Susan Laurie, as Oren tells the story, said, "No, you should do it. I'm not gonna. You should do it." And so that was kind of the impetus for Oren to reach out to John. And Oren has a history with the novel. You know, that if he were here, he would go into the depths of. But So he reached out to John, and John said, go ahead and do it, and if we like it, we'll see what happens with it. And so we did that reading in 2005, and it was semi-successful. And I think we realized that, from my standpoint at the Classical Theatre of Harlem, we just didn't have the resources to do this thing justice. It's a tremendous responsibility to take this work and put it forth in a new medium. And so we decided that it wasn't right for us to kind of continue an involvement with it, and nor was the estate at that particular moment in time ready to allow it to happen. Fast forward, I guess, 5 years, in 2010, I decided to, after 11 seasons of running the Classical Theatre of Harlem, I felt it was time for me to step off that hamster wheel and allow somebody else to take over the organization and take it much further than some skinny white kid could take something called the Classical Theatre of Harlem. And I started making lists of things that I wanted to work on, and Invisible Man was always on that list. And after having spent so much time in Harlem and moving on from that, I felt lost kind of in the world from a creative standpoint. And so naturally, I went back and I picked up the novel, which I had read 4 or 5 times previously at this point in my life. And I remember the adaptation that Oren did. And I went through my folders, and I found a copy of it and gave it a read, and reached out to Oren and said, what do you think of revisiting this and just doing a reading of it? So we reached out to the estate, and the estate said, yeah, go ahead, read it. We invited them to sit around the table. We had, I think, 3 hours worth of rehearsals. We got through the first, 40 pages of a 150-page script in that rehearsal, and then we read it around the table for the estate, and it was a miserable, miserable failure. Because we just, it's such a monster of a piece. But the conversation that sprung up around the table about where the novel sits in a 21st century context was fascinating. And I think it was partly that conversation, partly Oren's relationship with John, partly the glimmer of creativity that one, if you looked through the murk and mire, you could see in that initial reading. They allowed us to do a second reading of it. And this time we got together for a week. And we started to work through Oren's adaptation, and we read it, and again, the estate saw something in what we did. And then what we realized was, we should, if we're really going to do this, we need to go back to the novel. We need to take the script that Oren had worked on and essentially put it aside. And I asked him to pick up the novel again, and essentially let's write a scene for every moment in the book. Let's really explore this in a deep, thoughtful, meaningful way, because it's not our material. We can't claim ownership of it. And let's bring as many people around the table to participate in this conversation. Let's work with as many actors as possible. Let's work with as many scholars as possible. Let's work with as many visual artists as possible. And create a sense of community and national ownership of this project. And that's part of what our time here this week is about. And so Oren he's an amazing collaborator. And so we sat down with John Callahan, and we asked Oren to write, and we sat down and we read the novel out loud, and we highlighted sections, and we should have this, and we can't forget that. And suddenly we had a script that was, 250 pages long. And it would have run for 6 hours. But it was a brilliant process, because it allowed us to thoroughly get inside the novel and understand the choices that we were making. If we have a scene, we understand why we have it. If we're leaving something behind, we understand why we're leaving it behind, and we can defend those choices. And it just thoroughly, we just thoroughly immersed ourselves in the novel over the course of a year and a half, to the point where we're still writing and rewriting the script to get it right. And the script, as it stands now, it's in pretty good shape. But we realize that it's nothing more than a jumping off point, because once we get into a rehearsal room, we realize that, oh crap, we left this behind and we needed to connect to this moment. And so it's any piece of theater is a continuous work in progress, because theater is a relationship between an actor and an audience. And as much as we sit around a table and talk about it, and however much we get up in a room without an audience and explore physical ideas and explore visual elements, it's not until you get it in front of an audience that you really start to learn what a piece of theater is. And so this week, while we're here at the University of Iowa, we're basically ripping the script apart, and we're throwing it up against a wall and see what sticks. And we've given ourselves the liberty to fail in a rehearsal room, to try things, and see what we can discover in terms of the physical language of the piece, tapping into the tremendous, rich visual world that Ellison has created. And it's that, pulling that thread is what led me to Lena's writing at a moment when we were sitting down with our design team, figuring out how this production is going to function. We have Ellison's words on the page. Every word in the script belongs to Ellison. But what we don't have in the script, if you were to sit down and read it, is all of the rich visual imagery. And so we started to pull all of those threads to figure out how it would function in the media design. The production will have a tremendous amount of sound, a tremendous amount of video to kind of communicate the inner thoughts of the character. And it was in doing that work that we discovered Lena's writing, which kind of became a solid foundation for how we were thinking about the visual art that we would present in the context of staging the play. And so the process from here will take us back to New York for a week, where we have a 1-week residency at New York University, where we'll sit around with a group of 10 new actors, hear their creative voice on it. We'll work with scholars at NYU to throw some ideas up against them and see what they throw back, and see how that impacts the script and ultimately the production. And then we arrive in Chicago on December 13th, where we start a 4-week rehearsal process to premiere the production in January. On January 12th is our first preview, and we open on the 22nd of January. We run there for 6 weeks. And then from there, we hope the production will have a very long and far-reaching life. We kind of envisioned this when we picked it up a year and a half ago as a kind of 4-year celebration of Ellison. That would allow us a good year and a half to develop the project, premiered in 2012, which is the 60th anniversary of the novel, and then continue its life through 2014, which is Ellison's centennial. And so that's kind of what we've mapped out for this project. And anything that we do with it, we are standing squarely on the shoulders of folks like Professor Porter and Professor Michael Hill, Lena Hill, and so many people that came before them. And so again, we are thoroughly honored to be here and take on this enormous task, and we do so with great respect and well aware of the responsibility that we have that Sidney Lumet didn't get, or Marvel Comics.
We do have a little time for questions, and I will be running around, handing the microphone to folks so that your voice will get picked up on the recorded version. So I apologize in advance for running around. But is there anyone who would like to start us off with questions, or do you all have questions for each other? Oh, yes, my job.
I'm looking at making blackness visible, but in the conversation kind of bounced between black, African American. So I guess, is there a difference? Which is the preference for the play? How do you get that in there? That makes sense.
So,
Yeah.
All right.
well, I'll say that when Chuck and I first started sort of brainstorming with a group of others, Gene Foreman, Michael, Teresa, we wanted to both, we were excited about the opportunity to work with Chris and his team, but we also wanted this to be immediately connected to the University of Iowa. And so I honestly, Chris was the one who alerted me to the fact that Fannie Ellison had attended the University of Iowa. And then I had a lot of fun because I happened to be at the Library of Congress, and I started going through her transcripts and her notes. She saved all of her notes from her classes here at the University of Iowa. They saved everything. So we thought we wanted to make the Black experience here visible. And that's what we started with our panel last night. So that's one element. As far as how Ellison would have looked at that, I'm happy to have another one of my colleagues to speak to that if they'd like.
You mean the use of the word African American or Black? Ellison, it's very complicated. First, when the word Black came into usage, late 60s and early 70s, he was very reluctant to adopt the word Black as opposed to Negro. He felt that Negro had, over the centuries of its usage, become a word of pride, that it was certainly a better word than some of the other words that had been used in the past, that when the New York Times decided to capitalize Negro and everybody else followed suit, that was a huge cultural achievement. And he somehow felt that all of that would be lost by what he saw at the time as sort of a fanciful indulgence of a term essentially by college students, you know, Black pride, Black this, Black is beautiful, that was sort of bowing down to a slogan. But, of course, as things would have it, he was a very astute student of the power of vernacular culture and the power of political processes. And so when Black became the preferred term, he sort of, I guess, grudgingly conceded. As far as African American is concerned, you know, we're talking about now the mid-'80s, and by that time he was an elderly person, and he was sort of bowing out of all of these kinds of debates. I can't speak to how this is going to be handled in the script itself, but you know, the word Negro is used primarily in the novel, though there are moments of when he talks about Blackness and things like that, but not quite in the same way that we use it today.
Hi. I had a question regarding color blindness and invisibility. Obviously, being in the middle of Iowa, we're very, very white here. And we don't have the same history of integration that other like large industrial towns, like I'm from St. Louis, might have. In such a progressive town like Iowa City, a lot of times you'll see interactions of students where they'll say, well, if you go back to the metaphor, I guess, of the brotherhood, that we're all just people, and so I only see you as a person. We'll go to such lengths as to, in describing someone that they've just met, we'll describe them every single possible way except the fact that they happen to be Black, or if they are a person of a different race, to sort of emphasize that point, that I am so colorblind to this. But I feel like there's probably something missing in that adherence to like a staunch colorblindness, that it's refusing to recognize that, yes, we are all the same, but there are differences. So where do you draw the line? Like in the brotherhood, you have, people of different races, you have women, and they say, yes, but we're all the same. But we're not. Not everyone's the same. And how do you embrace the similarities and still embrace your differences? How do you make those, how do you make the important essential parts of a person's identity visible without, ignoring the history surrounding these? if that made any sense.
I can answer, okay, a very excellent question. I would answer that by saying that Ellison often quoted Walt Whitman, and he said that America is woven of many strands, okay? And that, so he had this phrase that he believed in the unity in the diversity of American experience, the unity in the diversity. So he saw it as not either or, but both things operating sort of at the same time. That, yeah, you know, we are all Americans, but that doesn't necessarily negate other aspects of our identities. So that's the quick, simple answer to the question.
Yeah, and I love that you point to the brotherhood to make that, to ask that question, because that's exactly what the protagonist realizes is wrong with the brotherhood. They don't actually try to celebrate what's so special about the Harlem community, and as a result, they exploit it and end up causing its destruction. So I think you're right. Ellison felt, and I think Professor Porter mentioned this in his earlier comments, that African Americans had contributed a great wealth to this country. And to suggest that you have a color blindness or that you don't see people coming from different cultural backgrounds that are bringing different experiences to the table, that you're actually denying the vibrancy of the nation.
When I think of Ellisonian character, I think of Barack Obama, because Ellison in his essays, I forgot that famous book of essays he wrote, he was interested in Americanism. Ellison didn't deal so much in race like race in America. He dealt with being an American. And you got to think about the history of this country. When we talk about whiteness, you had to earn your whiteness. Northern Europeans, and then everybody else came until the 1950s, and Jews became white, the last of the whites to become white. So this is what made the book so great. And the time we're dealing with now, people talk about the Great Depression. I wasn't born during the Great Depression, but to me, this is the Great Depression. And what he was talking about, how the couple got put out of their house, and he started reading. He saw their Freedmen papers. So Ellison is a peculiar writer, and he dealt with his devils. But Invisible Man is a system of books within books within books, so that it's hard to deal with, and I don't even know if most young people even read it now. But 60 years to still being published and to be a black author is a remarkable thing.
I think the group just says agreed. Interesting.
Yes.
Any other questions? Actually, it would be really fascinating to hear from some of the students in response to that comment, how your class is talking about the Invisible Man, if you're feeling brave. I like having a soundscape. Any other questions? Chuck?
Love this piano.
I have a question for Chris. We obviously are very gifted here at the University of Iowa with Ellison scholars. And is that usual? Is that typical around university campuses? Or I like to think we're pretty special here. And
Loaded question.
Absolutely special. Absolutely. The other Ellison scholar we've been working with is Kenneth Warren, who is at the University of Chicago. And so he's been part of our conversations since the University of Chicago came on board. But University of Iowa by far represents.
Great answer.
You get to leave.
Where will the play be staged? In Chicago?
It'll be at the Court Theater, which is the resident theater company at the University of Chicago.
Horace, you knew Ellison,
And Richard Wright, his friend, I didn't realize they were that close, but he went to Paris to live. He deserted America. And when you spoke to Ellis, did he ever talk about his friend in the sense of his leaving the country?
Yeah, they were friends, certainly early on in Ellison's career. Wright was already established as a writer. You know, as Michael indicated, Ellison eventually himself, after the publication of Invincible Man, became very, very famous, and Wright died sort of maybe 8 years in the 1960s, yeah. But yeah, he had a point of view on Wright's becoming an expatriate, and you know that he himself, with the exception of traveling in Europe and spending, say, 2 years in Rome on a fellowship, he not only lived in New York City, but he lived not on the Upper East Side or in Midtown on the or on the Upper West Side. He lived on the Upper West Side. He essentially lives in Washington Heights, up on 151st Street and a Riverside Drive. So he took a position in terms of where he wanted to be as a person. Obviously, he could have lived anywhere he wanted to, but he chose to live there in that particular neighborhood. So part of that may have been a kind of sense of what happened to Wright, or how he viewed him and how he viewed Wright's career. So, yeah.
Did this group tie in with Maggie Walker? Maggie was pretty popular here at one time in Iowa as a writer.
Margaret Walker?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that they were close personal friends or anything like that, but certainly they were aware of who she was as a writer, and her as a poet, and so forth and so on, and had an enormous amount of respect for her. Wright, in particular, had an interaction with her. As a matter of fact, at various conferences, she once said that people are going, quote, people are going around the country said, Wright and I were in bed together. We were an item. It never happened. So yeah, that was a real relationship between Wright and Margaret Walker, but not with Ellison.
Yeah, well, the gentleman who started the Writers' Workshop, he said that one of his biggest troubles with that Maggie Walker tried to get political with to get people to come here and be a part of the program. So, but I didn't know that whether it's true or not. He was just talking. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Good questions.
Any other questions?
Margaret Walker, didn't she write a book that said that Richard Wright's last wife poisoned him? And Damien Genius, or Genius Damon.
The demonic genius of Richard Wright.
Yeah, I could count on you. But when you know, you have to keep a sense of humor when you say who was related to who and what they were saying, because some of this stuff is funny. And like Zora Neale Hurston said about Richard Wright, he wrote sociology, I write literature. So we always got this little battle going on.
Sure, yes.
Did you say you had a question?
Hi, I wonder if anyone on the panel can speak to the fact that both Fanny before she was Ellison and then Ralph Ellison later at an episode of Grinnell both seemed to have pretty bad experiences in Iowa. She, in part, you know, as a student, and then Ellison himself when speaking at Grinnell. And so I don't know if maybe people are aware of some of that, but if you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, Fanny Ellison had many problems, and some of those were highlighted last night, but just because of the fact that, things weren't integrated when she was here. So she wrote basically that, to quote, I don't give a damn about my alma mater. I mean, she had very negative memories. But then she did acknowledge that things had improved. Ellison, because even he lived a long time, and as the woman over here was talking about the way that he viewed America and the way that he talked about race, once we moved into the era of Black Power and a kind of radical declaration of Black pride, Ellison was no longer the flavor of the day. Writers came out very strongly against him, and college students, because the Black Power movement really was born on college campuses, came out very strongly against Ellison. And at Grinnell and other places, he had some terrible experiences where students were disrespectful and they were very hurtful. And I don't know if Horace wants to talk more about this, but Ellison said, he was very hurt by the experiences because he felt that he was very devoted, very proud to be an African American. As Horace said, he continued to live, and he never moved out of New York. He never moved into a space that he could have. Yet he wasn't seen as radical enough. People called him Uncle Tom and other things. And that was a reality that he lived through. I mean, interestingly, people like Larry Neal and others reversed themselves later and sort of came around to finding real merit, particularly in Invisible Man, the text. But Ellison was a complicated person. Michael's research, I don't know if he wants to talk about, in thinking about prize-winning authors later, the tricky relationship Ellison had with them as well, I think might be interesting to bring into this conversation.
That's pretty much a pride. I mean, it's tough. I'm probably a minority voice on this panel, ironically enough, in that Ellison's experiences at a spot like Grinnell, when you are a minority student on the Grinnell campus, the last thing you want to hear is the one Black writer who you're going to get to see that year come through and say everything's not as bad as you think it is. Right? That's the last thing you want to hear when you are an undergraduate at a predominantly white Iowa university, is to hear somebody say, it's really okay. And Ellison, in many instances, was becoming more deeply implicated in the United States as a nation. Not just rhetorically, right? Because people say this, like he's got this sublime rhetoric he's being appointed to panels by Lyndon Johnson. He's receiving some pretty heavy perks with regard to institutional recognition. He's joining the Century Club. He's receiving some very elite perks. So on one level, yeah, he lives on Riverside Drive, but on another level, his day-to-day contact with the lived reality of these things is quickly becoming a historical relic. Like people are not walking up to Ralph Ellison saying, "Man, you're." So I think that this is a struggle. This is a balancing act that, as the sister had said earlier, that takes place in terms of the age of Obama. Like this is a balancing act. People are not walking up to every member of the African American constituency and say, "You're homeless. You don't have a job." I mean, you're a university professor. So they're like, "Well, what's up?" How deeply can you empathize really with the plight of the unemployed when you ain't been unemployed in your whole life, right? So, and I think Ellison and people of that generation felt a certain degree of obligation to represent what they represented, which was Black success. So when folks came to them to talk about Black failure, they were like appreciative of the reality, but at the same moment they were like, but take pride in me. And that's a difficult position to be in, right? Like if you're unemployed, you don't want to hear to take pride in me, right? People who on death row don't want to hear, well, we got a Black president. It'd be like, I could give a flip, right? I'm on death row. I want you to come, take care of me. And I think that this is a challenge that you see expressly in a later generation of prize winners, because their lives immediately engaged this. John Edgar Wideman had a son who is in prison for killing someone. So at the same moment that he was winning prizes, Penn Faulkner's in '84 and in '90, he's also going to the jail to deal with the reality of his sons being incarcerated. And that strikes him perhaps more profoundly than it struck an earlier group of folks as something that really marginalized the significance of his mainstream achievement. So where Ellison would say, recognize me for what I've achieved, Wideman would say, well, what I've achieved really means nothing because my son's in jail. And these are complicated questions, but since I'm prodded, that's what I'll say.
I just want to add a quick footnote to what Michael just said. I largely agree with what he just said, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't say this. That's to say, when Ellison would go to a place like Grinnell during the late 60s and Yale, where an even more dramatic incident happened, he was calling Uncle Tom, and despite one of his closest friends, R.W. Lewis, was on the faculty, he never, ever came back after many, many invitations after that moment. Because not only what Michael said is true, that he was highly respected. He had won many awards, greeted by the White House, et cetera. But at the same time, this is a man who's a black man who's dropped out of Tuskegee Institute, won the National Book Award, worked very hard, as Professor Lena Hill has indicated on his manuscript, and he wasn't having it from college students who may have been failing their grades and weren't working hard on their essays. He wasn't going to have them disrespect him like that. And so he resented it, and he felt, who are you? How dare you to tell me how to be a Negro? So he had his own pride and his own prickliness that also came out, and to some degree on the human level, as opposed to the Olympian writer that we talked about, is hugely understandable. And I just wanted to just toss that out.
It's interesting to hear you guys talk about kind of that conflict that comes, I think, between the different generations, and I think that's something that continually presents itself in the African-American culture. Like even me talking to my parents, even though we get along, there are always these conflicts because their experience is so different than mine, even though there are some similarities. And some of the things they faced, I face in a more subtle, or maybe not subtle, but just in a different way. So my question is actually for Chris. Professor Michael Hill, in his introduction, talked a lot about the environment in which Ellison was writing the book and where he was coming from. And now we're so many years beyond. We're in 2011, and the experience of African Americans and just Americans in general, there are some differences. And how do you respect the text, but at the same time, take into account where we are right now and where we're going?
Well, I think that's one of our greatest challenges. So in the rehearsal room, we've always said that, one of the greatest failures would be if somebody said, "Wow, they did it. They put the novel on stage." That's not what we're attempting to do. We're looking to tell a story that's immediate and that resonates, in the 21st century. One of the things that we've latched onto is just just trying to boil it down to a very simple place so an actor can execute, which is ultimately what we need to do. And so we've really latched on to just the universality of invisibility. Everybody has walked into a room at one point in their life and they have not been seen. And latching on to the fight, the need to be seen, the need to make an audience understand what it's like to be invisible, is where we've kind of taken our work in the rehearsal room. And I think latching on to that very basic idea of invisibility, I think will inevitably help us pull the story forward. I think on a technical level, I think the way that we're executing the production with the use of music and media, I think speaks strongly to how we consume in the 21st century. And so I think that has kind of been where our focus has been. And then also just finding the corollaries to the brotherhood in 21st century America. And what is that? Is it, and so we're pulling the brotherhood story forward to mirror the extreme political dissonance that we're experiencing right now in this country. So all of that has been part of our discussion. Again, with the ultimate goal of not just putting the novel on stage, but making it immediate. That's kind of been our focus, immediacy.
And my immediate sense is that I know several of our panelists need to jump in a car and head to Cedar Rapids. So I'll stop us now, but I want to thank the panel so much. You all have given us so much to think about. It's wonderful.